So yeah, I just wanted to start by introducing myself, and I was just going to give a bit of a disclaimer because my background is in psychology, but I'm not a clinical psychologist, and I've got a doctorate, but I'm not a medical doctor. So what I'm going to do is just do a talk that kind of attempts to demystify neuropsychiatric disorders and difficulties and deconstruct what we mean by those terms. And I'll be followed by Charlotte and Patrick, and perhaps we can save questions until after their presentation. So yeah, as Helen said, I have got a few different roles, and a lot of my work has been about understanding how neuropsychiatric disorders relate to one another and what happens when people have more than one neuropsychiatric disorder. Neuropsychiatric disorders and difficulties are difficult to understand, and they're quite difficult to explain. So I can talk for ages and ages about autism, and I have done to prisoners and in nightclubs to people who have asked me about it. But when you actually try and write down what these terms mean and understand them, it can be quite difficult. So this is kind of my way of describing it, but lots of people have different ways of describing it. And probably the best, I'll come to that later. So I'm just going to talk about a bit about this term comorbidity, which you might be familiar with, but just to explain what on earth it means and what we mean by neuropsychiatric problems and what kind of problems do people with TSC experience. And if you want more information about this, I really recommend the TS Australia website, because I think Vanessa and Claire have done an amazing job bringing together all of these ideas and laying them out. So there's some really great detailed pages there. So to get to there, you need to go to click on information. Oops, hang on. Is there a pointer on here? Click on information up there, and then down to behaviour, learning and mental health. And it's got a whole section, and that includes the TAND checklist, I think, is on there as well. So I think when we talk about when we talk about comorbidity, we're really talking about any disorders that occur together. And actually, when you think about it, there's very few health or mental health problems that just occur on their own. Usually, if you have a problem, it will then cause some other problems. And when we're talking about neuropsychiatric disorders, they're not part of the diagnostic criteria for TS. They occur alongside TS. We know there's some interaction and there's some overlap, but we're still working on understanding that in more detail. That's where research comes in to do that. So really, comorbidity can occur in anybody. Lots of disorders occur together. So if you think about in the general population, for instance, depression and anxiety really commonly occur together. And when we talk about neuropsychiatric disorders, autism and intellectual disability very commonly co-occur. And of course we know that TSC really increases the risk of a lot of neuropsychiatric disorders. And when we think about neuropsychiatric disorders, they're actually quite different from physical health conditions. So there isn't a genetic test or a medical test that we can do to diagnose somebody with the neuropsychiatric disorders. There's not usually one identifiable cause of that neuropsychiatric disorder. It's usually a combination of different factors that are leading to someone developing a neuropsychiatric disorder, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Oops, sorry. The way that we assess neuropsychiatric disorders is by looking at clusters of behaviour. So if somebody has certain behaviours, certain features, certain strengths and difficulties, then it's usually a psychiatrist or a doctor that would look at all of those and decide, are they enough for that person to meet a clinical diagnosis? So the things to remember about neuropsychiatric disorders, and again, this is what makes them quite different from a lot of physical health problems, is when you think about some of the behaviours and features and strengths and difficulties, these are things that everybody experiences. So if we think about depression, everybody has days that they're feeling a little bit down, a little bit sad. It's if that goes on and is very severe that it starts to become a problem. And it's the same with a lot of neuropsychiatric disorders like autism. Lots of people do things that are a little bit on the spectrum, a little bit similar to what you might find in autism, but it's only when those behaviours start to impact on people's functioning and when they're ongoing over a long period of time that we might start to think about the fact that they constitute a clinical diagnosis. And then underneath those behaviours and features and strengths, we've got the kind of brain processes that are leading to them. So if we think about autism, to have a clinical diagnosis of autism, you need to have some impairments in your social communication. And what that might mean is down at this stage you have a difficulty in understanding other people's theory of mind. So you can't necessarily understand what another person is thinking or feeling. You find that very difficult. And actually what we know now, or what we think we know, is that that might be linked to our processing speed in our brain, the speed at which our brain processes facial expressions. So if somebody's talking and their facial expression is changing all the time, and the person who's looking at them talking is not really, the time that it takes their brain to process that facial expression, by the time their brain has actually figured it out, the person has moved on and is talking about something completely different. So you can see how it would be really difficult to keep up with a conversation if your brain wasn't quite processing their facial expression in time with what the person's saying. So I just thought I'd read you some definitions of what neuropsychiatric means. But I think this was slightly covered in the talk just before. So neuropsychiatry, we're talking about problems that are caused in the brain and in the central nervous system. And with psychiatry, we're normally talking about specific disorders, these behavioural disorders. That can't be diagnosed through a single test. They're based on what a person says, how a person says they feel, what a person does. And they usually, there's usually a specific set of criteria against which a doctor would measure someone's symptoms to see if they meet the diagnostic criteria. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about why it might be that where we have 90% of people with TS have some neuropsychiatric difficulties, why we're then only getting 20% of people who have a diagnosis or are getting treatment and assessment. So neuropsychiatry is it's a psychiatric subspeciality, as we've heard, and it focuses on the neurological basis of psychiatric disorders. It might be about the evaluation and care of people with neurologically based behavioural problems. And then we've also got neuropsychology, which is another term that you might hear people mention. Again, it's about the brain, but this time it's more about psychology. So it's more about behaviour and thinking, about how the brain processes information, how that then affects our behaviour or affects how we feel. So clinical neuropsychologists provide assessment and treatment recommendations for people who have difficulties with memory, learning, attention, language, reading, problem solving, decision making. So it's much more about the kind of processes involved in thinking and then leading to behaviour. So I just thought I'd have a look at some of the specific things we might see in TSC. So over here we've kind of got the physical health problems, which are TSC and epilepsy. We've got our genes, obviously in TSC this is very clear. Genes are affecting the brain, the environment might be affecting genes, and the environment might be affecting the brain. And this can lead to developmental problems and mental health problems. So neuropsychiatric covers sort of both these terms really. And the differences between them are that developmental problems develop from early childhood. They are lifelong. But we can provide intervention and treatment to help symptoms of neuropsychiatric conditions, developmental problems, sorry. And then we've got mental health problems. They usually have a specific onset or start. So somebody doesn't have a mental health problem and then they develop one. They have a mental health problem. And in those cases, usually treatment would help the symptoms to the extent that the core problem is resolved. But the things that these two types of conditions have in common is they all affect our cognition, so that's how we think. That can affect our emotions, how we feel, and that can then affect our behaviour, what we do. And I just thought I'd list some of the conditions that we're talking about, and so you can see how they kind of break down into these different types. So with psychiatric developmental problems for TSC, we're thinking about autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia and dyspraxia. With mental health problems, things like anxiety disorders and depression, and kind of more mental health problems rather than these developmental ones on the left. But underpinning those are these cognition and behaviour and kind of psychosocial functioning. So people who don't necessarily have these disorders will still experience stress and worry and low self-esteem, kind of problems that they're still experiencing but not necessarily reaching the criteria for a diagnosis. And over in cognition and behaviour, we had these neuropsychological processes, and this is really how our brain works. So you've probably heard people talking about executive functioning. I've always found that a really difficult term to understand. So really executive functioning is all about how you plan to do something and then how you do it. And if you can't do that very well, or if you have trouble paying attention to a task or controlling your impulses, that can really affect your behaviour, and that's what leads to some of the behaviours that we see in the developmental disorders. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about icebergs for a while. I don't know how much time I've got left. But so an iceberg is a really good analogy for neuropsychiatric difficulties. So icebergs come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. None are exactly the same as the others. Just 1/10, so just 10% of an iceberg is above the water, and the rest is all underneath the water, invisible to the naked eye if you're above water. And the size and shape of the underwater portion of an iceberg is impossible to tell just by looking at the tip of the iceberg. You've got no idea what's under the water, unless you do some further investigating. Icebergs are made of fresh water, so they're actually quite different from the sea that surrounds them. And they're buffeted by winds and currents that are outside of their control. And over time, an iceberg can end up quite isolated. It can end up miles away from the glacier that it came from. And to be classified as an iceberg, the height of the ice must be greater than 16 feet above the water. Large icebergs are under surveillance by the US National Ice Centre. But anything smaller than an iceberg, so smaller than 16 feet above sea level, is known as a bergy bit, which I didn't know before. I think that's quite sweet. And these aren't under surveillance, so they're not being monitored. So this is how I kind of think that neuropsychiatric disorders are a lot like icebergs. So there's lots of external stressors from the environment, from people's surroundings that are putting pressure on them. Above the water is the really obvious kind of signs and symptoms that even though we know neuropsychiatric disorders are hidden disabilities, hidden disorders, we can see those signs and symptoms in the way that people behave, in maybe what they tell us. But lying underneath, we've got all these really subtle and complex difficulties. So right down the bottom might be things that we could only measure by EEG, say. So if we talked about the brain processing speed, we'd have to really do a lot of investigating to find out that those difficulties are occurring. And we might not necessarily see the link between those difficulties that our brain's having and what's happening at the top, our behaviour coming out. And I think that's a really important thing about understanding and getting good neuropsychological assessment, is because if you can understand that your brain isn't processing faces or that you have trouble controlling your impulses, it can really help you and other people around you to explain or to understand your outward behaviour, your signs and symptoms. And what happens a lot in perhaps in TSC, is that people have lots of bitty bergs. So they're experiencing lots of different psychiatric or psychological difficulties. None of them are quite big enough for them to reach diagnostic criteria. So none of them are quite big enough to be to have a diagnosis of autism or an intellectual disability. But actually, if we have lots of these bitty bergs, that can be quite difficult to steer around. So one boat, you're in a boat, you can probably manage to steer around that big iceberg. When you've got lots of these bitty bergs, it can be quite difficult to get any help, it can be quite difficult to get support, and it can be quite difficult to find your way, as these whales are finding out. So I think the keys really are that we need to be raising awareness. I think that's really true as well, particularly for mental health problems that co-occur alongside TSC and some of the developmental problems we've talked about, because a lot of times people with, say, autism do experience anxiety, and it's often attributed to their autism, when actually anxiety is a treatable condition. So we've got to be really careful that we're not attributing a treatable mental health condition to a longer term problem. And really it's all about raising awareness among doctors and among everybody else that these problems exist, making sure we can identify people early enough so they can get the support for the problems they're experiencing, and providing them with support and intervention. And perhaps in the future we might be able to find ways of preventing neuropsychiatric problems, and that's probably what Charlotte and Patrick are going to touch on a little bit in their talk. So, thank you.